Future Sense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nick Jeans and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, Future Sense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is Future Sense.
So we're going to get on now and talk about, I guess, what you could call second-tier hacks of this change, navigating this change process, crossing that rapidly flowing river, knowing the currents. And it's important to understand, just extending on what Nick said, that people don't change just because you tell them to. People have to go through their own change dynamic. It's not a rational decision. You know, people just don't wake up one morning and say, "Oh, these folks have been saying this, so I might just change," and be like that as well. You know, the process of shifting our values and our worldview is a process of deep adaptation that happens in our subconscious. So it's invisible. It's something that we can't know by definition. And if once we understand the patterns of change, we understand how this transformation process works, we can start to recognize the patterns in us as we start to change, although we still don't have necessarily any conscious control over that change process. We can at least know the terrain that we're navigating, and it becomes a lot easier once we can recognize that.
Yeah. I mean, clearly sometimes change can happen radically and in a moment for one reason or other.
It can, yeah.
An aha moment, an inspiration, some kind of experience beyond the normal paradigms of one's life.
Yeah, what you're talking about there is the tipping point. You know, the process of change is a long process that starts usually before we notice it.
Yeah, right.
You know, when we get the earliest inklings of something is just a little uncomfortable, but I don't know what it is. You know, that's typically the first response. And most people don't typically recognize that as a change process underway. They just feel uncomfortable. But once we understand the terrain and what we go through, then when we feel that, something doesn't feel quite right, then if we understand the pattern of change, we can recognize, okay, something in my environment is telling me, calling out a change process. And then, you know, we can start to work with that once we become conscious of it.
Yeah, of course, and that in the current growing paradigm of green layer 6 before the second tier we're going to be talking about now, there's the tendency, of course, naturally in that process for people to look inside to find ways to figure out what is this feeling I've got, what is this impulse I have, what is this change that seems to come that I don't understand, and so seek out groups or organizations or therapy, or perhaps we talk about often psychedelics, the new psychedelic revolution, things like that, in order to somehow stimulate or access that point that they feel in themselves that something is happening.
Yeah, exactly. And we have to go through that refinement process to build a solid foundation for this big leap, the momentous leap, as Claire Graves called it, into second tier. You know, we have to have that solid foundation and that quite refined capacity to sense and understand our own change processes. And I was talking in the first part of the show about the analogy of a rapidly flowing river and the change process requiring us to jump into the river. And typically in the first tier of consciousness, we're not aware of the currents, we're not aware of the patterns of change, we don't know what to expect in terms of our emotional response and the fact that we have to let go of our anchor points for our values and those sorts of things. And this is one of the key things that shifts as we move into second tier. So we're going to talk now about the second tier experience of change and how it can be so different to the first tier experience. One of the key aspects of that is our improved capacity for pattern recognition. So we get overwhelmed in first tier, and often we experience this overwhelm at the tail end of our navigation of the scientific industrial way of being human, where there's so much information available to us as a result largely of our technology. We just cannot analyze all of that data. We can't even become aware of all the data. It's just an absolute overload. And so we have to switch into a way of recognizing patterns where we don't have to look at each individual piece of data, but we can look much more broadly and see a pattern of movement within the data. And of course, science has come to that point where it's not presenting us with millions of pieces of data, but it's giving us a graph that shows overall trends and those sorts of things. But as with all things in the scientific industrial era, often those things are manipulated and changed in order to get outcomes that individuals want, rather than being a true representation of the genuine trend that we see. So there are traps. But in second tier, we have a much more sophisticated way of sensing this kind of pattern that's speaking to us during the change process. And using the river analogy, you could say that that's a capacity to just look at the river and immediately see where all the currents are flowing. So I guess it's like an extra sensory perception that sees what we couldn't see previously. And once we can see those big patterns, then the pathway ahead is much more clear to us. I mean, if we know where the currents are in the river, then we can go to the point in the river where we know the currents are favourable, and we can jump right in and get carried along by the currents with minimal effort. And this is a big characteristic of second tier ways of working with change, is actually going with the flow in a way that requires the least effort, and that works the best. Whatever works.
And again, it's paradoxical, because of course to some degree you've got to draw out from your personal direct experience of life. You've got to sit on the bank of that river and not be carried away, and using that metaphor, or as they often say, of course, being able to see the forest for the trees, taking that perspective. And there is a detachment there, and sometimes I think that can feel for many people as if you're not actually engaged empathetically with life, and that can feel odd, I think, in a way. But there's a balance there, because it's not detaching completely, but it is actually being able to see the bigger picture, see the bigger movements within the river.
Yeah, and that it's a very good observation, and that what you said about it looking like a bit of a cold reaction or response from other people is a typical first tier perspective of second tier, and it really is rooted in the fact that in second tier there's a massive reduction in fear, and fear is no longer a major driver, whereas in first tier value systems, fear is an absolute major driver, and often we're acting in various ways out of fear rather than some higher level of perception.
And of course, in this last gasp of the current paradigm that's been dominating for a long time, fear is being used absolutely in every possible way, and in my opinion, as a sort of last-ditch attempt to hang on to power, because it is such a drive, and most people on the planet will still respond to fear to one degree or other, and be compelled or impelled in one direction or another with that.
Exactly, and it's one of the key indicators of the transition into second tier, is that falling away of fear as a major motivator. And as you said, for somebody who's still very much driven by fear, seeing someone who's fearless can be a frightening thing, because the obvious assumption there is that, okay, this guy's not feeling what I'm feeling. Must be something wrong with them, right? And as you say, often people can be labelled as cold and unfeeling, but it's just not the case. It's just that the fear is just not a major motivator. And I'd be really interested to hear of any research, if anyone's aware out there in listener world, if you're listening to the podcast later, if you're aware of anybody who's researching neurological correlates for this reduction in fear that comes with second tier transition.
Well, go on.
Because it must show up logically. It must show up in our biochemistry and our neural networking and the operation of our things like our default mode network. I'm sure, but second tier consciousness isn't really on the radar of mainstream science yet, so it's still very much a fringe area.
But I guess we mentioned the word gratitude earlier, and we'll come back to that now, because clearly, in order to within yourself find perhaps a better place, a better posture to look at that river, to remove yourself out of the swirling eddies and have a look at the river, there are certain qualities that one can practice and adopt that seem to have neurobiological components which are supportive of a bigger picture, and gratitude perhaps is one of those.
Yeah, definitely. And this is very much an emerging field from a sort of grounded science point of view. There's some wonderful research being done by the HeartMath Institute. They've been leaders in this kind of stuff and still are in many respects. And it's we're talking here about a whole body transformation that happens in the transition from first tier to second tier. And I guess you could say that of all of the major shifts between layers of consciousness as we go through these transformations, we are reconfigured in a whole being sense, not our things like our neurochemistry, our neural networking, our subtle energy fields, and those sorts of things change with these transformations because there's an underlying change in our framework for interfacing with reality. And again, this is fringe stuff. It's not really been mapped well from a mainstream science point of view at all.
But it's also true, for example, UCLA's Mindfulness Awareness Research Centre. It's another one of these centres which, yes, it's out there on the fringe, but it is housed in an authentic university. But they say having an attitude of gratitude changes the molecular structure of the brain and keeps grey matter functioning and makes us healthier and happier. When you feel happiness, the central nervous system is affected. You are more peaceful, less reactive, and less resistant. Now, that's really a cool way of taking care of your well-being. So it says. The thing is, of course, for many people that'll be challenging because people want to take action now. People feel angry. People feel like they need to do something in order to make a change in the world. So I think it's not really either or, is it? I mean, it's a transition between the two somehow. Yes, you can have your strong response to what's going on in the world and want to make a change, but perhaps your attitude of mind inside yourself, to yourself, with yourself, and thus outside can actually enhance and perhaps bring forward a different response, so that looking at the river and perhaps better solutions in the long term.
Yeah, an interesting question is if somebody becomes educated in what changes inside them as we go through this transition and understands that, okay, there are changes here, and we'll post on Twitter and Facebook a link to this article that we're quoting, which is from collectiveevolution.com, and has references to the sources for the science also.
Yeah.
And the science is saying that people who express gratitude on an ongoing basis show greater neural sensitivity in the medial prefrontal cortex, a brain area associated with learning and decision making, and the prefrontal cortex also is implicated in the moderation of fear responses as well. So again, there would be some correlates here with that massive reduction in fear, and the reduction of fear is a major driver. I look forward to the science really becoming more complete and more readily available around this stuff.
Indeed.
Also, from that same article, they're saying here that it's this work has proven, the research has proven that when a person is feeling really positive emotions like gratitude, love, appreciation, the heart starts to beat out a different message. So there's a change in our heart signature, the energetic signature of the heart. And which also, of course, determines what kind of signals are being sent to the brain from the heart. And we're learning that the brain responds to the heart. I think many of us have grown up with this education around the brain being in charge of everything, and everything's controlled by the brain. But in fact, that's this recent science is changing our perspective on that, and I must say that Chinese medicine for a long time has regarded the heart as the emperor of the body.
Yeah, right. Yes,
so there is some wisdom hidden right there. It's been around a long time.
Yes, and of course the very new area too of work on the gut and the gut biome is another aspect of that, and taking the brain off the throne, so to speak, and going not just the heart but also the gut itself, which generates about 90% of our serotonin, for example. If that's in good condition, then you're also enabling your neurochemistry to have a more integrated beingness within yourself.
Yeah, exactly. There's some quotes here from Roland McCready, PhD, who's Director of Research at HeartMath, which I might just read out. Yeah. And he's talking here about the change in the heart signature that comes from these feelings of gratitude and love. And he says emotional information is actually coded and modulated into these fields. And he's talking about the electromagnetic field produced by the heart. By learning to shift our emotions, we are changing the information coded into the magnetic fields that are radiated by the heart, and that can impact those around us. We are fundamentally and deeply connected with each other and the planet itself. And although that might sound like a fluffy New Age kind of a statement, these guys are doing a lot of research around the planet's resonant frequencies, and particularly as expressed by things like the Schumann resonance, and how our own radiated frequencies interact with, adapt to, are influenced by, and are influencing those planetary fields. So it really is leading edge stuff and very, very interesting.
Yeah, so later on in the article it speaks about every individual's energy affects the collective field environment. This means that each person's emotions and intentions generate an energy that affects the field. And this is powerful stuff if you really take this on, I think, and we see this clearly when a bunch of people get together in any way. Obviously the energy affects the collective field, but if that energy has this kind of gratitude, heartfelt, deeper, loving response, and yes, it does sound a bit fluffy and so forth, but feel it, because you've probably experienced this one way or the other, either individually or in group situations, where things can literally and magically even transform in a moment just by that attitude, that coherence, a heart coherence in the field, in yourself and with those who you are around with at the time.
Yeah, and Roland McCready is quoted here talking about that heart coherence. He says, one important way the heart can speak to and influence the brain is when the heart is coherent, and that means experiencing stable sine wave-like patterns in its rhythms. And when the heart is coherent, the body, including the brain, begins to experience all sorts of benefits. Among them are a greater mental clarity and ability, including better decision-making. And all of my personal experience and my study of Clare Graves' work is pointing to the fact that this is a developmental aspect of human nature. So it's not that you can just grab anybody anywhere and put them into heart coherence and that they'll all be experiencing the same thing. It really does depend on where you are at in terms of your growth, your own progress, development, and your energetic configuration. And there will be some people who are more liable to very quickly move into this particular way of being and coherence than others. And again, all of that links back to our life conditions. So the complexity of our life conditions and the degree to which and the speed at which we have adapted to fit those life conditions then determines, where we're at in terms of our readiness to step into this kind of coherent way of being. So life conditions are the key, and that what that tells us is, from a second-tier perspective, is that if we want to support change in the world, then one of the most effective ways we can do that is by looking at the life conditions of the people that we want to support and helping improve those life conditions, which in turn allows them to adapt in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, bottom line, very simply put, if you are struggling just to stay alive, just to put food on the table and just to have a roof over your heads, like a very large number of people on the planet still are, you don't have a lot of time for larger existential thinking about everything.
Exactly.
We do have a question that's come in, and we don't have time to go into depth of this, but maybe you can truncate it. This is a challenge for you, Steve.
Yeah.
Can you please explain what the second tier is?
Oh, sure, yeah. So second tier is a term that came out of the research of Clare W. Graves, who did a whole bunch of data gathering over about 9 years on 1,065 people, and then all of the data he collected, he distributed to a group of 7 peers, as well as working on it himself, and asked them to look for patterns in the data. And out of roughly around about 20 years of analysis after the data was collected, he managed to organise the subjects in his study into a progressive process of personal growth, where these people were adapting and behaving and demonstrating different values in a stepped sequence that went from most simple to most complex. And he found that this growth that happens to us as we move through the first tier and into second tier is an absolutely natural process, but it requires the triggering of our life conditions for us to be able to adapt to different levels of complexity. And he also identified the change dynamics, so what we experience when we go through the changes in between each one of those steps. And the layers of consciousness that he identified were nested inside each other, so kind of like those Russian dolls, where one gets put over the top of another, and so you build a complex layer or layered sequence of capacities. So each one is not necessarily an individual thing. They're not things that we move between, but they're layers of capacity that we add. And as we add further layers, our capacity to cope with complexity increases, and our capacity to perceive things increases. And the most significant change in this sequence that he identified was between the 6th layer and the 7th layer, and it was such a massive change. He realised we were moving from one category of being into a different category of being, and so that's where those labels, first tier, second tier, came from. And second tier consciousness equates to what many people have been talking about for thousands of years, this massive shift in human consciousness, which has been predicted by lots of ancient civilizations, and is all the focus of the new age movement.
Yeah, the Age of Aquarius is one example. One term you could say was applied to that process and analysis. And of course, these things come, they evolve themselves. So earlier iterations are, you could say, more naive. It's even simplistic, and as we get more complex, and the configurations of these become more complex themselves.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're doing on this show is trying to sort of provide some grounded scientific context to this big shift that's going on and help us understand it better. And not only that, but by understanding human nature better, help us to navigate our personal change and the global changes that we're facing in a more effective and smooth way than we could otherwise.
Indeed. You're tuned to Future Sense with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up. Yes, it's 10:41 here on Future Sense, and we're talking today about, what are we talking about? I've lost track. No, kidding. I've been sitting by the bank of the river watching the river flow, and I've just lost myself.
Let me take over. So we're talking about the process of change, and specifically now we're talking about second-tier hacks and how, from a second-tier perspective, second-tier consciousness that is, we can experience change very, very differently. And one of the key aspects that we've covered so far is understanding large-scale patterns and the pattern of the change process itself. And in the first part of today's show, we went through that change pattern, and particularly the emotional experiences as well that come with navigating that change process. And it's like anything, if you have a map and you know the terrain and you know what to expect, then it becomes much, much easier to navigate. And that, this process is really something that unfolds during the sixth layer of consciousness, so the last layer that we go through in the preparation for the big shift into second tier. And then once we get into second tier, it's just a different ballgame completely. And we've been talking about some research from the HeartMath Institute, looking at the impact of feelings of gratitude and love and how they change our body. And there's evidence from their recent research of changes to the prefrontal cortex, which may also be associated with this big reduction in fear, which comes with the second tier transition, and also changes to our heart frequency. We've got some quotes here from Roland McCready, who's the Director of Research at HeartMath, and we've been reading through some of those, and I might just read a little bit more because it's really interesting stuff. Roland says, research findings have shown that as we practice heart coherence and radiate love and compassion, our heart generates a coherent electromagnetic wave into the local field environment that facilitates social coherence, whether in the home, workplace, classroom, or sitting around a table. As more individuals radiate their heart coherence, it builds an energetic field that makes it easier for others to connect with the heart. So theoretically, it's possible that enough people building individual and social coherence could actually contribute to an unfolding global coherence. And as part of their research, these guys at the HeartMath Institute are interfacing with, like I said, readings of the Schumann resonance, which is the Earth's background resonant frequency, and also the global coherence research, which is based out of Princeton University, where they've got random number generators stuff around the world, and they're looking at changes in the randomness of the numbers that they're generating, and looking for correlations with large-scale human experience, significant events that impact us emotionally and how it impacts that whole field around the world. And while, again, this is very, very early stage research and would be seen as fringe by most mainstream scientists, probably what they're tapping into here is that there is something going on in terms of large-scale correlations. And if you flick across to quantum mechanics and you think about the observer effect in quantum mechanics and the fact that our presence, our consciousness observing a particle at the quantum level somehow changes its behavior.
From the same article, a study they've done in the 1980s during the Israel-Lebanon war, from two Harvard University professors organised groups of experienced meditators in Jerusalem, Yugoslavia and the United States, and asked them to focus their attention on the area of conflict at various intervals over a 27-month period, so significant. Over the course of the study, the levels of violence in Lebanon decreased between 40 and 80% each time a meditating group was in place. The average number of people killed during the war each day dropped from 12 to 3, and war-related injuries fell by 70%. Now, that's a radical claim, but it's exactly what we're talking about here.
It is, and we're talking about radical things. We're talking about a radical shift in human consciousness here that is largely not even on the radar yet of mainstream science around the world. And I would urge you to try this at home. So, there's
one thing you can try at home.
The best way to really see if this works or not is to give it a try. Well, I'll tweet a link to this and post it on Facebook to this article that we're reading from here, so you can look up the research yourself. You can see what they're talking about. Try practicing gratitude, and in my own personal experience, I've found that my capacity to I guess you could say radiate gratitude has changed over time, and I can see through my own experience, or my own experience is that my subtle energy configuration has changed over time, and I get a sense of a deeper, and I mean deeper in terms of a larger field, growing around my body, and that expansion of my own body's electromagnetic field, making it easier for me to feel and hold gratitude and hold it in a deeper way than I have been in the past. So I really would encourage play with that, and treat it as play, treat it as fun, and just see if there are any changes in your life experience. And you might want to try focusing on one particular part of your life, one particular aspect that maybe you want to change, and then feeling grateful for that change as if the change has already occurred, and expressing that gratitude ahead of the fact of the change, and then just see if the change happens perhaps more quickly than it might have otherwise.
Of course, this might be easier to do in some aspects of your life than others, and I'm thinking now this is a very activist area that we live in here in Byron Shire. For those of you living overseas listening to us, you probably know about us and you can check us out anyway, but a lot of people here are very active with regards to some of the big issues on the planet. Climate change, obviously, the general poison of the environment, of the water supply, everything that's going on here. And so criticism and critique seems to be absolutely necessary. We need to sort of, would seem for many, go up against whatever there is out there, take action, get out in the streets, make a noise. And all these things have had and still do to some degree, no doubt, have their value. Can you do both? Can we actually practice gratitude and practice what we're talking about here, this sort of coherence of a deeper response to life, and at the same time, take some sort of action against the issues that we see on the planet? Is that possible?
I'm seeing some evidence of that in some of the coverage of the Extinction Rebellion protests, where people are clearly in the streets in a space of love. And it's interesting and important to reflect on that, and also to reflect on other occasions where people are showing up as angry, disturbed, depressed, and imagine what kind of electromagnetic field they're radiating there, and now how that is impacting people around them. And I think one of the big examples of that has been coverage of key figures in the movement, urging people to get angry and clearly expressing anxiety, depression, angry publicly over the media, which is very, very, you've got to question, okay, what signal is that sending out? How is that impacting people? And then we're hearing other reports of kids becoming depressed around the whole issue and those sorts of things. So there's a key and radical difference in the approach that we're talking about here of holding love and gratitude, and coming from an optimistic place of expecting the best and expecting change for the best. And just to pin this down with a little bit more solid science, I'm just going to read some more from this Collective Evolution article. And it says, so far the researchers have discovered that the heart communicates with the brain and body in 4 ways. Neurological communication, in other words, through the nervous system; biophysical communication through what they're calling a pulse wave; biochemical communication through hormones or messenger molecules; and energetic communication through electromagnetic fields. And quoting the researchers once again, and I believe there's 2 paragraphs here, and at the bottom they're saying the source is Dr. Deborah Rosman, the president of Quantum Intech, who's clearly working with the HeartMath people. And she says HeartMath research has demonstrated that different patterns of heart activity which accompany different emotional states, have distinct effects on cognitive and emotional function. During stress and negative emotions, when the heart rhythm pattern is erratic and disordered, the corresponding pattern of neural signals travelling from the heart to the brain inhibits higher cognitive functioning. This limits our ability to think clearly, to remember, learn, reason, and make effective decisions. In contrast, the more ordered and stable pattern of the heart's input to the brain during positive emotional states has the opposite effect. It facilitates cognitive function and reinforces positive feelings and emotional stability.
Very good.
And then further from the same article, it gets deeper. Every individual's energy affects the collective field environment. This means each person's emotions and intentions generate an energy that affects the field. A first step in diffusing societal stress in the global field is for each of us to take personal responsibility for our own energies. We can do this by increasing our personal coherence and raising our vibratory rate, which helps us become more conscious of the thoughts, feelings and attitudes that we are feeding the field each day. We have a choice in every moment to take to heart the significance of intentionally managing our energies. This is the free will or local freedom that can create global cohesion. And you know, if you're a hardcore scientist out there, then you're probably thinking that last paragraph is stretching things a little bit. But there are very, very good indicators in the research that are pointing us in this direction, and it aligns with my personal experience for sure.
Yes, indeed. Someone's just written here, gratitude is never held. That is oxymoronic. Gratitude is given. Yeah, well, that's true enough.
I guess it's semantics, isn't it? It depends what your definition of held is, and I think your definition of held is grasping or something like that, and mine is simply resonating. Held is a resonant frequency in the way that you hold a musical note.
And that's really interesting, just that, because it does take a certain practice and a consciousness and a certain place of coherence within the self, which is exactly what you're talking about, to hold that. And then from holding that, that is given naturally because it's present in the field.
Yeah. So I'd suggest there's a reimagining needed there of what that means, and you can use whatever word you like, but probably think about playing a musical note on a piano, and when that note rings out, you're holding that note in the same way that if you were singing to that note, you're holding a particular frequency.
Yeah. And of course, criticism, which we're not dabbling too much into today, critique is a permanent part of our culture now. It's what we do in politics and economics and religion and science and law and art, civil society. It's the way that democracy actually seems to work. But it's not working very well, so we do need a different approach, clearly, because the structures are failing, and you can go up against them, but it doesn't seem to be making much difference at this point.
And it's evolved that way naturally because we've moved out of the agricultural era where we were following some set of rules from a higher authority, and to break out of that, we had to become critical thinkers. We had to stop blindly accepting instructions from a higher authority and start to critically think for ourselves. And so that has become, for a very good reason, a natural part of the scientific industrial way of being human. And now we're moving to a point beyond that where that used to work really, really well for us, but now the world is a much more complex place, and so simply thinking critically is not going to solve our problems. We need to find other ways. And so what we've spoken about so far in the show, particularly in this second half of the show, the second tier hacks into the change process, and we are tools that you can use, and you don't necessarily need to be at second tier in your own personal way of being to benefit from this, because these things are also tools that can accelerate your progression into that second tier way of being by understanding large-scale patterns, and particularly patterns of change, which then allow you what to anticipate, what to expect, and it's I guess another analogy would be skiing down a mountain where in one point. In one example, you don't have a map, so you've got to be, fearful of what might be around the corner. But if you have a map and you know the path, then it becomes much, much easier to ski, much more quickly and smoothly. And secondly, the idea of gratitude as a strange attractor. So, and this, in one way of looking at it, is really about working with the quantum field. It's talking about taking advantage of quantum mechanics and the way that they work. in that we actually have an impact on what manifests around us. We have an impact on and free choice to create things in our life, and through adjusting our own personal resonant frequency, then that becomes a much more pleasing and effective process. And I will again send out a link to this article that we've been talking about, but it's quoting evidence research from the HeartMath Institute that shows that by holding a particular frequency which aligns with feelings of love and gratitude, that then we can become much more influential, not only on our own way of being and our own experience of life, but on those around us, and perhaps even at a global scale.
Yeah.
The research is pointing in that direction.
Indeed. Well, that's it for the show. Thanks for your last text. Thanks to Dudley, one of our listeners. Thanks again, guys. Once more, you're right on target with what is important right now. Well, let's hope so. We're doing our best to present slightly different angles in a very complex time. We'll be with you again next week. You can always check out our podcasts. Edited podcasts are available from futuresense.it. That's the easiest. If you haven't done it before, just go through that website, and that's a portal to platforms, and you can basically get it on most platforms, podcast platforms anyway, or at Future Sense Show is our Twitter account, and as Steve said, those articles that we use will be posted there. We'll be with you next week. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Future Sense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. Future Sense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.